Hello? Hello? Well, thanks so much for coming back, everyone. You know, the one good thing about hosting a conference at the end of February is that people come back after lunch, because it's not like they're going to the beach or the pool or anything like that. So thank you all for coming back. Looking forward to a very intriguing, interesting afternoon. We have a great panel. This panel is really going to be about the legislation and enforcement issue set. We've got four really well-respected, well-known panelists here. Each of them are going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. I'm going to do a little intro for each of the four of them now, and then we'll get started with Sean. So Sean Hammond is the Assistant Deputy Minister of Safety Services Division at Alberta Transportation. He's responsible for implementing Alberta's traffic safety plan, leading a coordinated effort of 12 government departments with the goal of reducing collisions, injuries, and fatalities on Alberta's roads. Over the past 25 years, he's been extensively involved in the development of national strategies for things like chemical spills response and risk reduction strategies related to dangerous goods as well. So he's got a wide range of experience that he can bring to our discussion here today. Pierre-Olivier Sénéchal is from the SAAQ in Quebec. He's got a master's degree in history from University de Quebec à Montreal. Since his arrival at SAAQ, he's been working as a road safety advisor in the development of road safety programs in Quebec. Chris Whaley is here as well from the OPP. He began policing as a First Nations constable at a small fly-in community called Cat Lake in 1993. Since then, he's been in Manotick, Long Sault, Winchester, the former traffic and marine section at the speed management coordinator, road safety coordinator, Provincial Communications Center in Aurelia. Chris, you get around. That's a lot of jobs. Holy smokes. But most importantly, I do want to cite this. On 4 occasions, he has received the coveted Commissioner's citations for investigative excellence, bravery, and innovative safety initiatives. Our final presenter here in this panel is Antonio Evanoso, Executive Director of the European Transport Safety Council. Antonio holds a degree in political science from the University of Pavia and a master's in European studies from the University of Cambridge. He's currently the executive director of the council, where he's been working since 2001. We'll be really interested to hear about some of the trends and progress in Europe from Antonio here. And within ETSC, he's actually worked on a number of international research networks and road safety programs, so he probably has a little bit of insight about what's working well here, and maybe can do a little bit of comparative work for us. But we're going to start with Sean.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff. I'm going to sort of give you a bit of an outline of how tough it was to get Alberta's legislation through. And let's see if this works. There you go. Some background. It's more of a policy development and how we had to interface with the political levels to get the extensive or the extended distracted driving law through in Alberta. So bottom line is that I would run an operational division. We do all of this, all the elements, the driver, the commercial carriers, the dangerous goods, the rail safety, and so on. But importantly, at the bottom, we've got an Office of Traffic Safety, and their job is to implement Alberta's traffic safety plan, which does adopt the safe systems approach. So we have drivers, vehicles, and the engineering group from transportation comes in and provides that element. So why do we do it? In 2004, when Minister Stelmach, before he became Premier, was Minister of Transport, he commissioned a study by former RCMP K-Division Superintendent Don McDermott to take a look at the traffic safety issues in Alberta. That year we had 387 fatalities. The McDermott report was produced in 2004. It was taken in by government. They took a look at it, and they decided to put together a traffic safety plan, which was published in 2006, late 2006. And that year we had 453. The numbers were going up, and they continued to go up the following year, even though that was the first year where we put in place the traffic safety plan, the 3-year action plan in Alberta in 2007. By 2010, we reduced the number of fatalities on Alberta roads down to 344. But the bottom line is still the same. Every year in Alberta, we kill the equivalent of an elementary school on our roads. And it's a significant number. And that was the start of our traffic safety plan interventions and getting these strategies implemented. We talked a lot about this morning about driver error. Our analysis shows that 90% of the collisions on Alberta roads are driver error. There's very few collisions that we can put down to mechanical failure or environmental conditions. In fact, when there's heavy snow in Alberta, we tend to get fewer collisions as opposed to the summer, which is our graded number of collisions in that period. But we're starting to get a lot of pressure in the TSS with respect to distracted driving. It was a problem. Now, Brian Jonah was very diplomatic this morning and did not point out that in 2007, the 2000 numbers showed that Alberta observed cell phone use was twice the national average. Right? At that point, when these numbers came up, combined with the US study out of NHTSA, talking about distractions, our politicians were definitely swayed by the research and the evidence that showed Alberta was not doing very well, and in fact the problem was getting worse. So with this evidence, we were tasked to go away and do a review of the situation in Alberta. We did. It started in 2007, and we put together an analysis of the situation there. We took a look at all of the research that was available at the time, and given that there were a large number of jurisdictions that had put in place cell phone legislation, we took a look at the nature of the frameworks around those pieces of legislation. Was it a primary offense, secondary offense, cell phones only, cell phone and text, graduated young drivers versus old drivers, that kind of thing. We took a look. We talked to a lot of the jurisdictions to find out what was working, what wasn't, and in addition to which, we talked to our own stakeholders. And like I said, we get a lot of pressure from emergency room physicians, from the Coalition for Cell Phone Free Driving, from the Alberta Center for Injury Control and Reduction, all of whom wanted us to move into this area very quickly. Very early on, we figured that the other distractions were also a concern in Alberta: the eating, the grooming, the distraction inside the vehicle, reaching for objects, and so on. So we pulled in an enforcement subject matter expert group to work with us on what we could do. We also looked for pre- and post-analysis. Did anybody do an analysis of collision history before and after? Given that, we looked at failure modes, and then we said, why isn't our current legislation working? At the time, Alberta had a driving without due care and attention, which everybody said should do it. Well, the problem was the fine was $400, and there were 6 demerits attached to it. And every time a police officer laid one of those charges, they ended up in court because the driver would fight the charge. 6 demerits is a lot. It turns out that the officer was spending so much time doing this that they were reluctant to use that for a simple cell phone violation. So we published the report in Note 7, and one of the telling features that we had to overcome was that there was no available research suggesting that such legislation has contributed to a reduction in the number of collisions. We just couldn't find the numbers. Given that, we took it forward to our minister, and he was not necessarily going to push this. But then an Angus Reid poll showed that 89% of Albertans wanted this. They wanted us to do something about it. And at the same time, one of the counties implemented a cell phone ban inside the county. It's an issue of a jurisdiction. Did it apply on all roads, just county roads, and so on? We went into the spring session in 2008, and one of the private members introduced a handheld cell phone ban, a bill to prohibit handheld cell phones while driving. It was referred to committee by the legislature, and this was our opportunity to put forward our case for a much broader cell phone or distracted driving legislation. In fact, the evidence from folks like you swayed the MLAs on that committee to recommend that we not proceed with a cell phone ban, but in fact introduce the full distracted driving. So we put together a project team. A minister's report came out in 2009. We took a look at how could we do this. Could we include a may not drive distracted, and this includes but not limited to cell phones, texting, all that good stuff. Lawyers told us we couldn't do that. So we tried distracted driving and aggravated distracted driving. This would be cell phones and a cell phone plus speeding, cell phone unsafe lane changes. That didn't go either. So finally we got the agenda and priorities approval for the distracted legislation, and that meant we had the support from the Premier and Cabinet. And so we put together a simplified approach, no aggravated, and it did extend into some of the other behaviors. The legislation was drafted, but it went into limbo over the Christmas period. At very late in the spring session, the second last bill to be introduced was the Alberta Distracted Driving Law. And at that point, the public debate was ignited. We were accused of being a nanny state, interfering in people's lives, all that good stuff. Huge outcry against this piece of legislation. But our minister stuck to his guns. He wanted a comprehensive approach, not just cell phones. He wanted something that was practical, enforceable, right, and effective. And that was in response to the issue of hands-free. When we were asked to consider hands-free, enforcement told us there was no possible way at the time that they could enforce a hands-free ban. So we talked about it and decided not to include it. And to be honest with you, that's the fundamental reason why we do not include a hands-free ban in Alberta. We looked at a fine plus demerits. We also looked at some exemptions. We did some risk analysis, and we developed some House amendments. Interesting enough, there were 3 amendments that were proposed, or that were passed. The first one was search and rescue. Search and rescue use cell phones or radio communications, so we excluded them. Second one was police and emergency services, and included an exemption for a driver making an emergency call. The third one was from Industry Canada. Industry Canada have vehicles moving up and down the highway, and they have screens and laptops. They measure the strength of the cell phone system on the highway. So we thought, well, this is great. Don't give them an exemption, and the cell phone system will gradually disappear from the highways. Not a good idea, so we gave them their exemption. In the fall of 2010, the amendment passed, right? So now it's taken us 3 years to get it through. The target date for enforcement was mid-2011, June of 2011. We developed a communications plan, an enforcement plan, education awareness, all that good stuff. Just after April of 2011, we ran into a problem. And the issue was with respect to enforcement. The minister was concerned that the way we had worded the offense sections in the legislation meant that somebody who was just looking at a built-in GPS or a screen would be in violation, and the ticket would be issued automatically. So we had to take another look at this and rewrite the offense sections. I delayed the enforce. So on September the 1st of 2011, 6 months ago, Alberta's legislation came into force. So what does it cover? It's going to cover everything. Handheld cell phone, texting, emailing, using electronic devices, laptops, cameras, TV, or display screens, entering or changing data on a GPS screen, reading printed material, writing, printing, or sketching, and then the one that everybody gets after me about is personal grooming. They feel that it's a gender bias there. It's not. It really isn't. It came to force. The Office of Traffic Safety did the implementation, and then 2 weeks after we brought it in, they handed it off to the line unit that's actually administering it now. So what do? We're looking at evaluation, observed cell phone use. Brian talked about that. Enforcement action, tickets issued, the number of tickets for different violations, collision data, and then some collision root cause analysis. Some of the things we still have to do is we decided to hold off on that as to whether or not to include these infractions as appearing on a driver abstract. If the offense appears on your driver abstract, your insurance company gets to see it. And there was some reluctance to do that at this time, so we held off on that. What do we do about repeat offenders? Those people that consistently get caught talking on the cell phones. Still have to look at that. And then, are there any failure modes? Are there things that we forgot? So if I take a look at what we found, remember this is 6-month-old data. In Alberta, in 2007, 10.7% of drivers were observed talking on the cell phone. We did not do a survey in 2008. We actually backfilled behind Transport Canada and CCMT and did our own pre-surveys. In 2009 and 10, it was 4.4 and 4.9 of drivers that were observed using cell phones. In 2011, October, when we did the survey again, we replicate the same method that Brian talked about this morning. The numbers were 0.9. There was an immediate effect. Now, a lot of this had to do that it took us a long time to get it in. There were huge media campaigns. It was talk show topic of the year, distracted driving. But it got it out there into the public domain, and people had an opinion. Now, the next slide is raw data. It has not been cleansed. It has not been filtered, and in fact, my researchers are probably watching the webinar are going to kill me when I get back to Edmonton tomorrow. We needed to take a look at collisions. Did we see an impact on collision data? Now, the first problem we had was, first of all, the traffic safety plan is a plan that encompasses the whole year. We tackle a number of things, speeding, impaired, all the rest of it. The second thing that happened in January of 2011, we raised the collision threshold from $1,000 to $2,000. So, of course, we're going to see an impact on overall collisions. But the one thing that hasn't changed is casualty collisions, fatals and injury collisions. So we took a look on a month-to-month basis on how the collision data proves or disproves whether or not our distracted driving laws have an effect. Again, I must stress, this data has not been filtered or cleansed or anyway, but here we go. If we use if we use 2011 as one, normalize around that, the first 3 months of 2011, the casualty collision rates were the same. They were basically just the way they've always been for 3 and 5 years. From the time we started launching the education campaign, from April through to September, the casualty collisions dropped substantially, in the range of 15 to 20%. The October through November data is really still raw, and there's another effect. In October, the Premier announced low blood alcohol content legislation, which was passed. So currently, there's a huge debate about 0.05 in Alberta. So we think that there's a double effect there. But at the end of the day, we believe that our distracted driving legislation has reduced casualty collisions in Alberta based on very preliminary numbers between 10 and 15%. So what are we going to do going forward? We have an enforcement calendar that we repeat. Every February is Distracted Driving Month. City of Edmonton is reporting that we wrote just as many tickets this year as they did last year for cell phone use. That's okay, but they're out there. March, and I believe October, are seatbelt use. So the police across the province focus on seatbelts, but they use the same tactics to detect cell phone use as they do seatbelts. We're getting 3 months of the year where there'll be a concentrated focus across the province on cell phones and seatbelts. So that's how we did it, and that's the preliminary early results that we're seeing. We're really pleased with the observed cell phone use decline. The collision data will have firmed up by June, and so we'll be able to give the final numbers on that. So I think it's time for me to hand over. That was just the odds ratio. So I'll hand over to Pierre. And
problem. Bonjour à tous. Ça me fait plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui et de participer à cette conférence. Hello everybody. I'm pleased to be here today and be participating at this conference. First of all, I would like to extend my thanks to the conference sponsors. Here's the outline of my presentation. I will briefly address the basis for a ban on handheld cell phones. Then I'll talk a little bit about the legislation in itself. As you all know, there are very few governments that have evaluated such legislations or the ban on cell phone while driving, and Quebec is no exception. And now you are wondering what am I doing here? However, we do have some data that allows us to draw a few conclusions. And finally, what's the future action? What's next? The decision to introduce a ban on handheld cell phone was primarily based on a convergence of scientific evidence. As you know, a large majority of studies recommended prohibiting cell phone use while driving. And Sean just talked about it. In Quebec, a systematic review of scientific literature published by the NSPQ, l'Institut National de Santé Publique du Québec, made 3 recommendations. A total ban on cell phone use while driving, regulate the installation of in-vehicle telematics, and modify collision report. The decision was also based on international experience. The fact is, before 2007, more than 50 countries or states had already prohibited the use of handheld cell phones only while driving. None had prohibited the hands-free cell phones. Also, there were recommendations made to government, including the most important of all, the one from the Road Safety Task Force, la Table québécoise de sécurité routière, in 2007. Favorably consider the introduction of new legislative provisions to control the use of cell phone while driving. It is this recommendation to lead to the ban. Finally, we relied on surveys indicating the level of public support to the possibility of banning the cell phone. So in 2006, 93% of people in Quebec approved regulating cell phone use, 49% approve a total ban, 44% approve a ban on handheld cell phone only. Then, in 2007, when the Minister of Transport stated their intention to ban handheld cell phone, we did another survey. 95% of people believe cell phone use should be regulated. 46 approved a total ban. 49 approved a ban on handheld devices. With the result that the government decided to change the Highway Safety Code by introducing Section 439.1. No person may, while driving a road vehicle, use a handheld device that includes a telephone function. For the purpose of this section, a driver who is holding a handheld device that includes a telephone function is presumed to be using the device. This prohibition does not apply to drivers of emergency vehicles in the performance of their duties. Section 439.1 was worded to facilitate enforcement by police. Whatever the device is used for, the simple fact of holding it is an offense. Therefore, it is an offense to hold a device and carry on a conversation, type or read text message, surf the web, use it as a GPS application. So that's why there's we don't mention texting while driving in our legislation. The only fact, the fact to hold, just holding it is an offense. The provision targets all devices that includes telephone function, whether or not it is activated, and can use a telephone network. So regular cell phones, Blackberries, iPhone, Android, smartphones, cell phone that comes with a transceiver function, walkie-talkie, push-to-talk. I'm thinking of, for example, a mic from TELUS, which can be a walkie-talkie. It's banned. And also device that displayed emails and internet navigation possible. So the new iPod, the iPod Touch, would be a device that would be banned while driving. The government decided to introduce a three-month adjustment period. Peace officers promoted awareness at first. Only July 1st, 2008, they started giving tickets. The penalties are $115 to $156 with charges and 3 demerit points. Before 2007, the collision report did not specify the cell phone, so it was modified in 2 ways. Identification of the cell phone as the probable cause of the collision, so a box to be checked by the police officer on the collision report. It's under police interpretation. And the use of a cell phone by each party involved in the accident. This information is obtained by findings, witnesses, confession. Those modifications appear only in March 2010 on the collision report. And now the question of the evaluation of the legislation. Does the number of accidents increased or decreased since 2007? Well, the data available since the collision report was modified are more or less conclusive for now. Unless the peace officer obtains proofs or a witness's account or a confession, it is difficult to know if one of the drivers involved was on the cell phone just before the accident occurred. It's even more difficult to establish that the accident was related to cell phone use. Are we able to enforce the legislation? Yes, we are. Here are the numbers of convictions for 2008, 2009, 2010, totaling more than 100,000 convictions. We conduct field studies on distraction driving. In 2007, of all the drivers observed on a street corner, 6.87% were distracted. Were distracted by handheld cell phones, smoking, eating, drinking, other distraction, observable when the vehicle is passing by. For example, dog, children, passengers, telemetric data. Among the 6.87%, 2.44% were distracted by a handheld cell phone. Just so the data that are in red are just the handheld cell phone. In 2010, we add the headsets, so hands-free system were added to overall distractions. So the data for 2010 and 2011 is they are targeting also, not targeting, but they are the headsets are there. Details of these observations will be made public at the April 2012 conference of the AQTR, l'Association québécoise du transport et des routes, which is held in Montreal. The population still strongly agrees with the legislation. In 2009, we did another survey. 48% is for a total ban, 43% for a ban on handheld cell phones. We did also a survey for following texting at the wheel awareness campaign that showed that 95% recognize that distraction is a serious problem. 99% agree that texting is quite or very dangerous. 80% agree that talking on a cell phone is quite or very dangerous. 53% of drivers who use a cell phone admit to talking on the phone while driving. 26% do it quite or very often. Among the drivers who talk on the cell phone, 33% talk mainly on the handheld cell phone. 48% talk on the hands-free cell phone. 19% uses both the handheld and the hands-free system. The perceived risk of being involved in an accident is considered small or very small by 64% of drivers who talk on a cell phone while driving and 16% of drivers who text while driving. Drivers who use a cell phone while driving, so 54% of drivers are cell phone users. Among them, 57% believe that the risk of being caught is rather low or very low. About the hands-free devices. ASAC had the duty to inform the population about the coming into force of the ban, and we did. However, a separate campaign explaining that hands-free devices are not any safer than handheld devices would have been required. But as you know, a public awareness campaign is very expensive, more than $1 million. The media reported the coming into force of the ban, focusing mainly on the obligation that to have a hands-free system without mentioning that the risk was similar. It created a false sense of security. This false sense of security is also enhanced by the mobile phone industry, which conducted a huge campaign to promote the sales of the hands-free technology and went as far as telling the people the device were safer. I don't know if it happened in Alberta or Ontario, but it happened in Quebec. Here's the next step from an interview with a Radio Canada reporter. Our sales representative says, because they have both hands on the wheel, they are much focused on the road. I'm not sure about that. Here's another example found on a website. Driving responsibly should be your first priority while behind the wheel, which is right. Drivers are encouraged to use hands-free unit or handsets with speed dial or voice dial function, which I think is wrong. And I would like to point to you the second dot. Tips for responsible driving. When you use your mobile phone on the road, let the other person on the line know you're driving. This way, if you encounter a problem on the road, you can easily cut the conversation short and focus on driving. Well, I'm not aware if there's any scientific studies about that, but I'm not sure about that either. As LASAC, we think as a motorist, you're responsible for driving safely. You should then turn off your phone before you get behind the wheel and let your voicemail take your message. About the CB, just a little tip about the CB. In 2007, it was not the legislator intent to ban the use of CBs, although a decision by the Superior Court of Quebec recently supported a first conviction. CBs have all the characteristics of a device that includes a telephone function. Accordingly, they contravene Section 439.1 of the Highway Safety Code. So we are facing a bit of a problem here. So as a result, consultations are currently being carried out with our industry partners. Approaches used in other jurisdictions are being examined, for Ontario, for example. And the need to amend Section 439.1 is being considered. In conclusions, concluding the ban helped improve the road safety record is not clear-cut, because an analysis of the data from collision report has not been conclusive to date. As evidenced by the number of convictions made since 2008, the measure is enforceable and enforced. There is a strong support for the measure. There are even some who wish for the legislation pertaining to hands-free devices. Nonetheless, numerous drivers continue to use both the hands-free and handheld devices. Perceived risk of accident is low. Perceived risk of being caught is low. The cell phone use continues to increase steadily. No ban might have led to an even more critical situation, but that we can't know for sure. This situation is most likely not specific to Quebec. Unfortunately, there are no quick fix solution. Only the accountability of all drivers will bring improvement to this road safety problem. This is why we have to continue raising awareness about the ban on handheld cell phone, the ban on texting, the danger of having a conversation on a hands-free device, the importance of managing all kinds of distraction that may affect driving, and we have to continue the police control through pairing a roadside operation with awareness campaigns. Je vous remercie de votre attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great job. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Boy, you just finished lunch and half the crowd's already asleep. I'm normally a walker, but I'm going to stay behind the podium today because when you guys are looking at the webcast again next week, I don't want you showing your colleagues going, "Watch, this is the part where the cop falls off the stage. It's great." So I'm just going to stay put. When Dr. Burns put up his graph of sort of the pre-in-crash and post-crash status, the police are probably the only partner in this room that are involved in all three of those stages. We have a piece in the pre-crash in terms of prevention, mitigation through enforcement, voluntary compliance through writing tickets, increasing the risk so that people will voluntarily comply. We also investigate the crash. If it's all the crashes, all your data that a lot of you collect based on the collision reports, it's us that puts that data into those reports. So we have a role to play there as well. And certainly post-crash. I've had a fantastic career in the OPP for the last 20 years and many more years to go. But the two things I hate about being a police officer are death notifications, and I hate going to a postmortem. And that is a role that we have to play after the crash as well. So those of you are in here that are policymakers, that are researchers, that are law enforcement, that are safety advocates, don't lose sight of the fact that we take everything that you guys create for us and we use it to try to prevent these things. We hate doing death notifications, and we do a lot of them. So we take what you folks do. If there's ever a day that you're sitting at your desk and you're frustrated and you're saying, why am I continuing to do this? I don't see the results. We see the results. We're the ones that are the pointy end of the stick, that use what you folks do for us and try to apply it in the best way we can. So I don't want to go on the assumption that everybody knows who the OPP is. So just very briefly, the Provincial Police in Ontario provide policing services to 322 communities from 166 different detachments. We're a very large agency. We're a pretty big company. We have 6,152 uniformed officers, and we're supported by well over 1,800 civilian staff throughout the province. So when we want to get something done, there's a lot of links in that chain to get it from the top to where it actually hits the road at the front line. And that's one of our challenges. We are responsible for user safety on all the provincial highways, as well as trails and inland waterways, which also come with their own certain challenges. Many of you in here probably know that Ontario is a leader in road safety in North America. In the last 10 years, we've either been number 1 or number 2 in terms of road safety. I certainly won't claim that the OPP gets all that credit, but we do our part. In fact, in the last 4 years, we've consecutively won international awards for our road safety programs. The photo there is Deputy Commissioner Larry Beachy and Commissioner Chris Lewis accepting an international award for our efforts in road safety. In 2011, we saw an additional decrease in the number of fatal collisions that we investigated, dropped by another 13%. Which is fantastic for us. We've made tremendous progress over the last 10 years. Our efforts aren't just with respect to our roadways, but our trails and waterways as well. As I said, they both have their own set of circumstances that we have to focus on, but we don't lose sight of the fact that our job is to protect those users as well. So in 2007, the OPP created this thing called the Provincial Traffic Safety Program. In it, we outlined the 10 pieces of the puzzle for us that are going to maximize the potential of our resources in terms of reducing fatal collisions. That is our goal, is to reduce fatal collisions on our highways, trails, and waterways. We've had a great deal of success with that. One of the fundamental elements of our Provincial Traffic Safety Plan is to use our data to decide what we do tomorrow. We look at our data and say, what are the primary factors that contribute to fatal crashes? And that's what we focus our resources on. We don't manage by anecdotes. We don't focus on just what our police services boards want throughout the province. We decide what we're going to do based on our data. And we've had success with that. So when we look at our data, and we do it regularly throughout the year, we initially came up with this thing called the Big Three. The Big Three in terms of common causation for our fatal crashes, which were initially aggressive driving, which included speeding, non-compliance with seatbelt legislation, and impaired driving. So no surprises there. but it was in September of 2010 where we really had another look at our data and said distraction is becoming the next big thing. The research is overwhelming that distraction is indeed the next big thing in terms of road safety. So we weren't going to remove something from the big three, so we added distraction to what is now known as our big four. What we ask our officers is that if you're not busy responding to a call for service, we want you doing one of the big four. Go out and write a seatbelt ticket or a distraction ticket, or go catch a drunk driver. That's where you're going to make the greatest contribution to road safety. Traffic is a job worth doing well, and in a police officer's day, there are so many demands in terms of what they should do. It would be nice if the only thing we had to decide is which way to turn out of the parking lot when we left the detachment. But when you look at the demands that are placed on our limited resources, we really have to make the most of it. So we have to market to our frontline officers that we want them to do a good job in traffic, and we explain to them the reasons why. And they buy in. They want to do the right thing. But there's a lot of competing pressures for an officer's time that day. So when we look at our specific statistics, and these are from 2011, we had 260 fatal crashes just in OPP patrolled areas. So that's not the province of Ontario, because there's a lot of other municipal police agencies. That's just OPP patrolled area. Those 260 crashes took the lives of 284 victims. 47 of those victims were killed in impaired-related crashes, or 16.5%. 61 victims as a result of excessive speed. This is amazing. We heard earlier that compliance is around 95% for seatbelt legislation, yet that 5% who don't buckle up represent almost 25% of the dead occupants in our fatal crashes, which is absolutely tremendous. So 70 dead as a result of just not wearing their seatbelt. When we look at the studies and the data with respect to distraction, it's all over the map. You can find data anywhere that supports 20 to 50% in terms of causation of fatal crashes. Our actual number is 19.1%, but as we've heard here, and I can certainly substantiate it, that distracted driving is significantly underreported. When we show up at the scene of a crash, and perhaps we have a single motor vehicle into a ditch, when we get there and speak to the driver, they don't say, well, I was texting, actually. I was just trying to get a real quick text message off, officer. They don't tell you that. They don't tell you when they fall asleep either. So if you don't have a witness that can substantiate what the circumstances were behind the wheel when they crashed, they don't volunteer that information. So again, we market to our officers. It's critical that we have good data, because we use our data to decide what we're going to do tomorrow. So when you fill in that traffic report, make sure you've done everything you can to have a complete investigation. So if there's a cell phone in the vehicle, it might give the officer an opportunity to ask a few questions. If they decide that they have enough information that they could go to the courts and ask for a warrant to produce the records of that cell phone, then we'll try that as well to substantiate whether this was indeed distraction or cell phone related. And that's a big piece of the puzzle. Distraction to a lot of people really means you're on the cell phone or that you're texting, when distraction is such a much more complex issue than just that. But for us, those are the things that are illegal. So they make more sense for us. So what did the OPP do about it? What did we do about it? Thanks to our friends at the NHTSA, we took what they had already done, the success that they had, and we tried to capitalize on that. So we implemented a 12-month strategy, and actually our 12th month was February. We've just finished that, and I think we've had fantastic results. But when we decided, what are we going to do? We have campaigns for impaired driving. We have campaigns for seatbelt. We go from campaign to campaign throughout the year, mostly focused on our big four in terms of causation. But we took a page right out of their playbook and basically tried to reproduce what they had done in Hartford and Syracuse. And I'm sure many of you know that. The enforcement study that was done in Hartford and Syracuse really showed that high visibility enforcement combined with a robust media strategy did indeed reduce the use of cell phones and texting. When we implemented that at the front line, it really started from a top-down mechanism. Our commissioner, the day after we decided we were going to call it the Big Four and include distracted driving, he was on television talking about the Big Four. And that draws in a lot of interest from the media. It gave us a great opportunity to talk more about it. Every time we did one of our campaigns on distracted driving, it was always accompanied from correspondence from our top command to the front line to say, we want you guys to do a good job at this. This is worth doing well. So just as they did in Syracuse and New York with the 4 campaigns, we also ran 4 waves of enforcement. We started in May, July, September, and just finished in February. We did a week of saturated media and followed that with a week of sort of all hands on deck enforcement, which is a little different than the way that we had done things in the past. We do 2 seatbelt campaigns a year, one in the spring and one in the fall, but we decided that we would go with 4. 1, because that's what they'd done in the bigger study, and 2, because the distraction campaigns are relatively new, and we wanted to get out of the gate strong and let the public know that we were serious about this. And again, we have to market this to our front line, and that's key in terms of increasing enforcement, is to get buy-in from the frontline officers that this is something that they need to become engaged in. So our results from last year, the number of distraction-related tickets that we wrote in 2010, which was really the first year of the legislation, it came into effect in the fall of 2009, but we didn't start enforcing it until 2010. That year we wrote about 8,500 distraction-related tickets, and in 2011 we wrote about 17,000. So we did increase the number of tickets dramatically. And I won't say as a result, but the researchers in the room will pull me aside later and say, you know, there's a whole bunch of reasons why you guys might have wrote more tickets. Maybe there was more cell phones out there, and I get all that. But what we did see was a 25% decrease in our fatal collisions that the driver condition is deemed as inattentive. So with my amazing skills in Excel, I created this graph. Why are you guys laughing? I put a lot of work into this. So you'll see our number of charges in the sort of the light purple color, I guess, at the front, and that represents the number of charges per month that we wrote in the year 2010. So it's fairly flat. In fact, there's just a little bit of a dip in the middle, which probably represents the fact that in the summertime we're busy with a lot of other issues. We have Marine Patrol, we have fewer officers because of vacation. It's a much busier time of the year, so we have less time to devote to, for example, campaigns related to distracted driving. But if you look at the 2011 numbers, which is the kind of pink color in the background, you'll see that each of those peaks represents one of our campaigns. What we'd like to do is to build on that so that there is no valleys in the middle. We want officers to do this every day. It's not just during the campaign that we go out and seek these dangerous drivers out. It's every day, all day. However, the good news is that even during those valleys, those non-campaign months, the number of tickets we wrote never dropped below the original values. So it never sort of went back to the 2010 values, which is a win for us as well. There is a correlation between enforcement and compliance. I think if we create a great enough risk for people that they will voluntarily comply, and that is obviously the point of the enforcement. It's been said already up here with respect to the risk. You know, the research that we have seen today, many of us have seen before, and it certainly tells us that distracted driving is bad. The research that we want now is how do we change the behavior? How can we best modify the behavior? Because my concern is that those risky drivers, if we can get them to stop using their cell phone, they'll just find something else to be distracted with because they actually prefer a certain amount of risk as they drive down the road. So they'll change their environment to suit that risk preference. They're trying to optimize the amount of risk that they're exposed to. So if you have them put down their cell phone and driving appears, you know, very easy to them at that point, it's a nice sunny day and there's no traffic and they think they've got everything under control. Even if they don't pick up their cell phone, they'll reach into the back seat to get their gum out of their gym bag, or they'll, flip through their iPod or shuffle through their GPS, or daydream about, where they can get cheap pool supplies or whatever it is. They'll find something else to replace that behavior. So tell us how to change behavior. That's the research that we need now. And the research that you have given us already is fantastic, because even though you may put out one press release and say, CAA says that the behavior of most concern to Canadians is texting while driving. Well, you send that out, when you come up with that information, but we'll use that throughout the rest of the year in all of our media campaigns. We'll put that in all of our media releases. CAA says this. OMA says this. We use that stuff repeatedly. So our challenges in terms of continuing the good work is certainly the quality of the data, making sure that the data that we collect and put on those traffic reports is high quality data. And that's a challenge for a number of reasons, some of which that I discussed already. Within our organization, we have a challenge with what we sort of refer to as initiative fatigue. Because as I said, we go from the impaired driving campaign to seatbelt campaign to Operation Impact, Operation Corridor, and then back to the seatbelt, and then back to distracted driving. And at some point, the officers say, I can't keep up. I left on my days off, and I came back, and I already have to start another initiative. So we have to be cognizant of that as well. And that's why we stick to the Big Four. Our initiatives only involve what we call the Big Four. And that is, again, using our data to drive what we do in our police cars every day. Engaging the media, the big difference between the project that they ran in Syracuse in New York and our project was that we didn't have any money to go out and purchase media. We relied entirely on earned media. So we tried to engage the media in different ways each time we ran a campaign. In fact, in February, we contacted the family of a distracted driver whose their son was killed in a distraction-related crash, and the driver of the heavy truck that killed him watched their son texting right up to the moment that he went into the front of the heavy truck. So we were able to speak with them and support them while they gave us some information that we could use with the media, and they even volunteered to be interviewed by the media to try to put that human face to the fatal crashes that we investigate. One of the things that we lose sight of in the big picture is the ripple effect of one fatal crash. There was a recent fatal crash in Northeast region that took the lives of 2 young children and another adult. And when you look at the circumstances of that crash, that are absolutely horrendous, where an 8-year-old is killed at the scene, the 13-year-old sister is medevaced to one hospital, then flown all the way to Ottawa from Temiskaming. Both the parents are in intensive care, and their 13-year-old daughter dies in Ottawa, and they get the news over Skype at the hospital while they're both in intensive care. The impact that has on the first responders and the families and the extended families and the little schoolmates of all those kids is absolutely devastating. So what we can do to change behavior is critical, and the police are a big part of that. We're the pointy end of the stick. And there's a lot of external factors that we don't control. For example, the courts. It's normal that there would be significant court challenge as these new distraction offenses went through the process. That wasn't a surprise to anybody. There's certainly an industry related to getting clients out of being convicted for those offenses. So we expected that. And that is indeed happening. We're working through that process, but not to the detriment of our efforts. Our message to our officers is if you lose a case in court, make sure it's not because you gave crappy evidence. You do everything you can to give great testimony, and if it's in the hands of the courts and it doesn't go our way, that's completely out of our control. So again, my plea to the researchers in the room is tell us how to change behavior. And the web is filled with things like this, and I don't put this up there to make light of a serious situation. If you can't read the bottom line, it says text messaging, LOL, no, I'm not busy, I'm only driving, which is certainly the mentality that we see out there. And even though you ask people, did you know that distracted driving or texting or using your cell phone in your hand while driving is illegal? Yeah, I did know that. Did you know that it's bad? Yeah, I did know that. Why do you keep doing it? Well, I mean, I'm a better driver than what most people are. The people that need to not drive distracted, I hope they get the message, but I'm a better driver than most of those people. I can do it. I haven't crashed, therefore I won't crash, right? That's the mentality. So I'm not surprised that your research substantiates that. But what we need now is better research on how to change that behavior. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I will start with a non-original statement. I would also like to thank the CAA and TIRF for having invited the ETSC, the European Transport Safety Council, here in Toronto for this conference. ETSC is a science-based, non-governmental organization which is based in Brussels, Belgium, and whose main task is to advise policymakers on transport safety matters. When the organizers invited me to this conference, I enthusiastically accepted straight away. Then I looked at the title of my presentation, and European Progress. I said, oh no, my God, what am I going to talk about? I can talk about Europe. It's my favorite topic. I can talk about Europe for the whole day. But what about progress? Where is progress? There is none. So what shall I tell them? I cannot speak for 3 minutes. I mean, this is not really behind the corner. So this is why I structured it like this. Introduction to ETSC and the EU. EU legislation, that's unfortunately not too much. That's where we would have stopped. And then I thought, well, Europe is not only the inverted commas federal level in Brussels. It's not only the European Union. It's also the member states, the 27 member states that make up the European Union, and where there is legislation, there is progress. Also, I wanted to touch upon the role of companies. We'll see they have a big role to play. And of course, some recommendations. This is what we do best. Well, this is the European Union in a slide. On the top, the European Commission. The European Commission is based in Brussels, and it is what transformed in the late 50s Brussels from the capital of Belgium into the capital of Europe. It's a very bizarre place. It's a bureaucracy, but it's in the nice sense. It's a bureaucracy. You see, it's the government of the European Union. It's what makes sure that it's the watchdog of the treaties. Makes sure that the treaties are implemented. And it's a place where they speak their own Esperanto. It's a language called Euro-English. Where you live of terms like comitology, trialogue, subsidiarity, and things like this. And they have a very important role. They are the initiator of legislation. So nothing can happen in Brussels and in the European Union if the European Commission does not start legislation. But this is only the first step. Then you have those two in the middle, left and right. Left is the Council. Left and right, they are together. They are at the same level because the procedure is called co-decision. So it's not enough to initiate legislation. You have to make sure that those two agree. And it's like cats and dogs. On the left, you have the Council, an institution of states. So there is a decision to be made about transport. Well, you have all the 27 ministers of transport coming to Brussels to take the decision. And of course, they are rather conservative. Why? Because they are representing states, and most of the member states would like to keep the powers for them, not leave it to the European Union. And then on the right, you have the Parliament, institution of people. People get elected to the Parliament to represent Europe, not to represent their country. And they're much more progressive. They would like to do a lot. And keep this in mind for the next slide, the division of role between Council and Parliament. I don't talk about the last two there, Committee of the Regions and Economic and Social Committee. Maybe we should stop the web streaming here, but honestly, they don't get listened that much. They are consultative bodies, and they say very sensible and nice things, but they don't get listened to, unfortunately. You can start it again. I hope you had stopped it. Competences of the EU. Vehicle safety, exclusive competence, very good. Type approval. What is a vehicle in Rome is a vehicle in Athens, is a vehicle in London. So if you get it type approved in one place, it can be circulating everywhere. And then infrastructure safety and driver behavior, well, that's a shared competence, and that's where problems start. Because of this principle of subsidiarity, which says in areas which do not fall within its exclusive competence, the Union shall only act in cases where its work is an added value compared to what would be achieved by the member states or by the regional level or by the local level. And subsidiarity in principle is not bad as an idea. The problem is that it is used and abused. The Council will always use subsidiarity as much as they can to keep their competence to themselves, whereas the Parliament would destroy, if they could, and this would be very good according to me, the subsidiarity. They would do as much as possible at the European level. Let's now talk about what was worrying me when I accepted to speak here, the EU legislation. Well, for the moment, we only have soft legislation. I was struggling finding the first two, this recommendation on safe and efficient in-vehicle information and communication systems, and another communication on an action plan for the deployment of intelligent transport systems in Europe. Usually, the longer is the text, the less meaningful it is. And this is really the case. I mean, honestly, I'm been the director of this organization for 10 years, and I didn't really know about these two pieces of, let's call them, legislation. Most important is the last one, EU policy orientations for road safety, issued in July 2010. They represent the strategy of the European Commission, so of the initiator of the legislation, for the next 10 years. And they are very important because they have a very strong target to halve the number of road deaths between 2011 and 2020. Very good. They also have 7 strategic objectives. And I've tried to find links to distracted driving, at least 2 of them. Increase compliance with road traffic rules and promote the use of modern technology. However, would you believe it, if you do a text search in these 21 pages of the publication, there is nothing on mobile phone use, distracted driving. And we think it's appalling because this is a document for the next 10 years. So you're thinking about the future, and we cannot possibly hope to do serious road safety work in the next 10 years without considering distraction. The Parliament responded to that, once again with a document that is non-binding, with the so-called Koch report. Koch is the member of the European Parliament who was responsible for drafting that. And this is very good. At least there is a call for the introduction of an EU-wide ban on the practice of texting, emailing, and web browsing. So you see, we go back to the what I said before on the Parliament being always the most proactive of the institutions. Right, this is where my presentation would have stopped, had I not decided to also talk about the situation of driving and distracted driving in the member states. And I could do that thanks to a report we have produced together with the Aegis Institute and the University of Leeds on the regulatory situation in member states regarding nomadic devices and their use in vehicles. It's a very dense report. It's 215 pages. You can download it, but of course it's not something you would read before going to bed. It's quite dense. I will only talk about the first of the 4 objectives of the report, which was to provide an overview of the legislative situation in the 27 EU member states. And the report has a definition of what are nomadic devices and concentrates on 4 of them: mobile phones, PNDs, music players, and also TV and video players. The regional scope was extended. We not only considered the EU27, but also Switzerland and Iceland. And one conclusion is that the situation is very non-homogeneous between member states. The first clear separation is between general legislation on the one side and specific legislation. For example, when it comes to mobile phones, almost all member states have specific legislation. They name the device that is causing destruction. On the other hand, there are also member states for other causes of destruction where the legislation is just general. So they talk about destruction, careless driving, dangerous driving, or phrases like this. Of course, you're not supposed to read what is in the table. This is combining the member states with the 4 devices we were considering, and trying to see whether there is specific general legislation or not at all. And you'll see the situation is quite a patchwork. The only case in which legislation is rather consistent is mobile phones. Well, you have all countries adopted specific regulations, except Sweden. This is really strange, actually. In Sweden, there is no legislation whatsoever on mobile phones, whether handheld or hands-free kits. And actually, Sweden is the safest country of the European Union in terms of road mortality. Well, maybe those who are against legislation would tell you that because of that, but of course, research fortunately tells us that Sweden is the safest country irrespective of their legislation on mobile phones. When it comes to the other 3 devices, you see the situation is very diverse. You have countries in which there is mostly general legislation, others in which, quite a few, in which there is specific legislation. And many of them just responded, well, we don't have legislation. So there is a lack of legislation for other technologies apart from mobile phones. Also, what is very different in European member states plus Switzerland and Iceland is the detail of legislation. We saw already the difference in the technicalities, hands-free equipment versus, for example, versus handheld, but also situational. For example, some member states say, well, the nomadic device cannot be used when the engine is running. So, for example, you cannot check your email if you are stopped at a traffic light because the engine is running, so you should be parked. Functional, and well, we've seen that, for example, there are cases in which texting is prohibited in any case. So you can use the mobile phone provided it is hands-free. However, there is no way you can use texting. Also the way of user for example, music players with limited level of sound. I don't know how you would enforce it ever. And also for navigation devices, for example, they let you use them, but you cannot use point of interest because this will tell you where speed cameras are. And also the location of mounting, the way of fixing nomadic devices. So the situation is very, very diverse between one member state and the other. One other conclusion we got from legislation, from another part of the study, is that legislation in itself has little influence on the way people behave. So legislation is there, but many simply don't care, and they keep on using their device. This is why we believe that there are a series of elements that could help in addressing this issue. Well, one that is not listed here is certainly a behavioral change in the terms of norms in believing in what you do. Many people in the European Union, in some member states of the European Union, were used to smoking in bars and in restaurants. And when they banned that, people thought, well, this is not going to be possible, there was going to be a revolution. But no, finally it worked, because people understood that that was good. And one aim would be to make people change their norms and make sure that they find this socially unacceptable. Sanctions. we found here as well very big differences with fine levels varying from 11 euros in some countries to 200 euros. You need $1.3, I think, to make €1. However, when we income adjusted the fines, actually, we noticed that the differences were lower, and some of the Central and Eastern European countries had fine levels that were as high as those of the western part of Europe. Enforcement, well, this is for us, of course, very important. However, there are many problems with which we identified. It is, and we've read that already, we've learned it today, it's technically difficult to enforce this legislation compared to other offenses. It is very difficult to assess from outside the vehicle, and there is miniaturization of devices that makes the task even more difficult. In the member states of the European Union, nowadays enforcement is exclusively subject to non-automatic enforcement. So you really have to look into the car and make sure that you catch somebody who is using a device. And in about half of the European countries, in the ones that are doing most of the enforcement, there is no regular enforcement, actually. There are weeks in which the police decides to target, for example, the use of mobile phones. So the levels of enforcement are relatively low. However, notwithstanding the low levels of specific enforcement, we found out that in some jurisdictions the offenses of distracted driving outnumber the traditional offenses such as drunk driving or driving without a seatbelt. Talking to the police, they told us that one element they're using for enforcing legislation is after an accident has happened, when there is an accident investigation, to use the call logs to try and understand whether the driver was using the phone the few seconds before having the accident. But of course, this is okay, but it doesn't prevent the accident. You can only use it after the accident has happened. So this should not be the aim of legislation. And the last valid point, maybe I should have deleted the question mark after the presentations this morning. There is a way of making legislation self-enforcing. I'm sure technology can help in making sure that the devices don't work while the vehicle is in motion. Now, third part of the presentation, I'm almost there. The role of companies. We are working a lot on work-related road safety. In the European Union, conservative estimates say that 40% of road accidents are work-related. And if you look at the other way around, 60% of accidents at work have to do with driving for work or driving to work. And as you can see from this slide, everybody is at risk, not only those who do drive as a profession, but also those who use their car for work and those who commute as well. So this is a big part of the population who is at risk. And distraction is certainly, well, not a big problem if you are in an office meeting and you get think about something else. You don't do any harm, maybe to the company because they will not use your brain, but it's fine. You can be very well distracted in the office meeting. But however, if you take the same person and you make him drive, well, this is harmful because distraction can lead to death, injuries, permanent disability. So this is why companies have also a big role to play. And for companies, it is important to stress when we talk to companies, we tell them, hey guys, investing in road safety is not only a moral obligation you have to preserve the health of your employees, it's not only a legal obligation, but it also makes sound business sense. Because preventing an accident, be it related to drink driving or to distraction, certainly helps you to save money, and it's certainly an investment you should think about making. Finally, Recommendations, well, what you should do a lot, but if they don't want to legislate, at least include distracted driving in the enforcement strategy, exchange of best practice, include distraction also in the work-related road safety strategy. And very important also, the last one is disseminate information on national legislation. Europeans are becoming increasingly mobile. They move very easily from one member state to the other. And honestly, apart from the legislation on mobile phones, it's not easy to know what's going on in the other member states concerning the various devices that are used. Member states, well, adopt clear and strict legislation, include distraction policy requirements in public procurement, integrate distracted driving into training and rehabilitation programs, well, enforce legislation. It's not enough to have it, you need to enforce it. And well, investigate also that in road collisions investigations. And finally, employers, well, we already just talked about that. Include a grey fleet. Make sure that there is employees buy-in. Make sure they know very clearly what I wrote there in bold. Employees must not make or receive calls when driving for work. That should be a clear policy rules. But also, you have to be smart enough to have an improved journey planning so that employees can stop, receive their calls, which have been left in the answering machine, and then factor in enough time to let them reply. And also educate clients so that they know that they cannot expect somebody who is driving to answer a call at any time. And finally, this is almost my last slide. This is the results of European Commission Road Safety Eurobarometer of 2010. And these are the perceptions of European citizens about the seriousness of road safety problems. You see, still, quite a few of them, well, quite a few, the great majority, 94%, believe that the greatest problem is drink driving. Drink driving is a problem, we don't want to deny that, but it is getting more and more social blame. It's less and less accepted. Nobody in the European Union would go in a car with a friend who has been drink driving. So this is granted now. And less people consider driving with a handheld phone or also without hands off, with an hands off as a problem. So for them it's less of a problem. However, when we talk to our friends in TISPOL, that is the European police network, well, they tell us that distracted driving is the new drink driving. Before, when you were patrolling and you would see a car going like this, you would think, oh, that guy is drunk. Now you don't think this any longer. You just think this guy is texting or is using the mobile phone. So this is why they should actually address it. Okay, well, this is the last one. I do hope you found the presentation interesting. If not, please don't say it loudly, because my kids are watching the web stream and they still think their dad is the best they could get. So I hope they will still believe this.
That's right, kids. It's a standing ovation. Questions for panelists here? Okay, well, I've got one. From the webcast, to Chris. The question really has to do with the training that police officers themselves do or get when they have the technology that's so prevalent in their own cars. So, you know, what are the rules around technology in police cars and officers being able to use that technology, and do they get trained, or is there rules and regulations and practices around them using it, not using it?
Do they? That's a very good question. And the fact is, police are not any better at managing distraction than the general public. For just about 3 years, I was the OPP's manager of fleet safety, so my job was to review every single crash that we experienced throughout the year. And I can tell you that in general terms, the rate of collisions involving police agencies is anywhere from 4 to 30 times higher than the general public. The amount of distraction in our vehicles is unbelievable. And it's far more internal distractions than you may understand as well. If you're on the way to a very serious call and you have the things inside your vehicle that you have to manipulate and the sources of external information like the police radio and other distractions inside the car, but the cognitive distraction is significant. You're trying to find the fastest way to get to that scene. You're trying to imagine what might be taking place when you get there. How can you best help? Who else is going? Have we been there before? Are there firearms registered to the residence? Is an apartment building? Do we have the buzz code? All these things that are going on in your head while you're on the way to the crash or to the call. So. We've really tried to focus on improving our officers' ability to manage distraction. We don't say we're trying to improve their ability to multitask because I don't think that exists. We're trying to get them to better manage distractions so that when they are on the way to the call, they know that the primary task is driving. And they can get the dispatcher to repeat the information once they've gone through the intersection or once they've got to the call, but they never get a second chance to go through that intersection. So they have to focus on the primary task. And we've really, I think, done a pretty good job over the last couple of years to get that message out. But we're not any better at it than anybody else.
Oh, that's very helpful, Chris. That's great. Question?
It's not really a question, a comment or two. First of all, I'd like to state that I've thoroughly enjoyed this day, and I know it's not over, and I'm looking forward to the last session. I do appreciate the research that is being done and highly respect the researchers that have worked on this sometimes for years, because as the OPP officer told us, that it's that research that really gives us the impetus to go about the things that we feel need to be addressed in terms of reducing injuries and deaths on our roads. The other comment I'd like to make is throughout the day now, we've heard the word accident quite a bit. Yet I struggle with that word because when we take a look at this research, we can easily identify that there were factors that were contributing to the end result, which was a crash or a collision. And I would just implore you that based on the definition of accident, that maybe the researchers would consider replacing the word accident with a crash or a collision, because the factors that contributed to the end result were things that could have been withdrawn from the environment, and by not withdrawing it, we could then safely assume that the end result would be a crash. So it's something that we've been working on in Ontario for quite a while now, and it's just a challenge I'd like to put out. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've heard that research indicates that the handheld devices are just as distracting as the hands-free. And we also know from the enforcement officers how difficult it is to enforce hands-free legislation, and that's why there isn't any. But what do we tell the public when there's a law out there that says you shouldn't be using cell phones while you're holding on to them, but we're not going to say anything about those that are hands-free? Is there a perception that it's safe to be using hand-free technology? And if that perception is there, should we be doing something in the way of education at least to make them be aware that the risk is still there? I don't know if anybody in the panel wants to comment on that. It's a bit of a policy conundrum, let's say.
Does anybody want to comment?
Sure. You raise a very good point, and we see it throughout legislation in North America. And I am very open and candid about the fact that I don't think it's any safer to drive hands-free than it is hands-held. And although the legislation differs from my opinion, the media work that we've done has directed people to the fact that any distraction, any diversion from the primary task of driving is going to be detrimental to your ability to make good decisions behind the wheel. So we've included that in our message, despite the fact that it's not legislated.
Mr. Jonah, maybe I would add a comment. Maybe that's the next step. First of all, you've got to inform the population about the ban. And of course, everyone is wondering, well, what are the behavior that are banned? That was the case in Quebec when we did media release or when we did interviews about the ban. The media were asking us, what can we do, or what can we do, or then what can we do? And the fact is that we were kind of in a flurry, or it was difficult to inform the population about the hands-free. Maybe it's the next step. The texting thing had a burst since 2 or 3 years, but it's going to be difficult to convince population that hands-free are as bad as handheld, especially when, like I've showed, that industry of the telecommunications are saying that it's as safer as because you've got both hands on the wheel. So,
Brian, one of the things that we found because we've got more offences than just handheld, we've got all those other bits set in there. We take a look at the enforcement, and we issue about 1,200 tickets on average a month since we've introduced it, but 90% of that is still handheld. About 5% is manipulating screens and so on, and the other 5% made up of the reading, drinking, all that good stuff. So our focus is on let's eliminate the big distractors in this, those being the more visible ones, the handheld, the screens, and so on. Certainly that the public debate is still out there. There's a lot of discussion around the fact that we did not ban hands-free, yet we moved into those other areas. So the awareness is out there. It's just that what we need to do, I think, is focus on that where are the big gains to be made, and certainly that's in handheld.
If you don't mind, I'll just add one small component to that. And I think something we learned this morning, I think, is absolutely critical to this discussion if we want to start having it with people, and that is what's the difference between a conversation in the car and a conversation through a hands-free device. Right now, I would say in the public domain, people don't understand that there's a distinction between those two things, and they don't think talking to somebody in the car is a big deal. So it will take some communications around what those true differences are, the EKG and those kinds of things, to be able to separate out those two things, because right now I believe that they are bound together, and it's seen as being unreasonable to tell people not to talk to someone in the car, and ipso facto unreasonable to tell people that they shouldn't be able to speak on a hands-free device. They haven't seen evidence that those are two separate things in terms of their impact on cognitive distraction. So that would be, for me anyways, something we would want to start the conversation about in the public education domain. Sorry. Next.
About 10 years ago when my children were learning to drive under my insurance policy, I looked up the literature on driver education. And at least in Ontario at the time, what it said was that, to everyone's surprise, that young people who actually went through driver education programs were more likely to have accidents than ones who didn't. Quite an unusual result. You can have a lot of theories about that. It's not my subject of my question, but anyways, one of the things the conclusion was then that the only thing that made people better drivers was experienced driving, preferably with an experienced driver. Hence graduated license, etc. So, but a couple of our speakers have said we need to put distracted driving education into education programs. Very good thing to say, but given that driver education programs don't seem to be that effective, I'm wondering if any of our speakers know of an effective way to educate young people about the dangers of distracted driving, or if not, what you would conceive of what kind of education you would give to young drivers that would have an impact and change behavior. Thanks.
Does anyone want to speak to that? Well, I'm shocked at the driver's ed thing. Is that true? Is everyone that common knowledge that driver's ed has an inverse correlation to you have more accidents if you do driver's ed or crashes?
But there's a school of thought that when you conduct driver training, that sometimes, especially with young drivers, you will increase their confidence faster than you will increase their skill level. So they don't always have the skill level that they perceive when they finish the training. So they leave the training and they say to themselves, now I've got the best training. I can drive even faster, I can leave less stopping distance, and I can attempt maneuvers that I wouldn't try before, but now I've got this great driver training. So there is that school of thought. But how to influence that is a very good question for our researchers.
But probably not a bad one for our next panel, right? Our next panel is around the education side. You were up next.
Yes. Question for Antonio. In the European states, are there any that have a total ban on cell phone driving, including hands-free? And if so, do we have any crash data from those countries that might indicate it's had an impact? And lastly, is there any migration towards a total ban in any European states?
I'm afraid no. Out of the 27 member states, 26 allow hands-free, and 1 allows hands-free and handheld. And there is unfortunately no migration towards this. The only talks we have is about enforcing this, about educating people, but it's a long way.
Thank you.
Final question.
So John Svensson, the Driving School Association of Ontario. I won't get into that debate. It is another one, but the preliminary research was for people who went early because of taking training rather than waiting the full time for their graduated licensing. And there have been some studies out of the U.S. that have reversed that tendency. It was a wake-up call for the driver education and training side. I do want to just touch on something else. I read something recently in the Chiefs of Police magazine that was actually, and this is for you, Chris, I think you're modest in terms of the statement there, but the OPP, in terms of dealing with distraction and other areas that deal with operating a police vehicle, managed to reduce their crash and incidence rate through highlighting things. And in fact, the assessment tools and so on that they used were cognitively based. So the write-up was the OPP, and they were held up as an example. So congratulations for that in terms of taking the information that we're learning here and actually putting it into the training curriculum, shall we say, for police. Antonio addressed something else, and this is really, I think, very generic. But you talked about corporations and companies and the fact that there's not just the bottom line for the losses, reputation, and so on associated with distracted driving crashes, but the reputation, the economic cost, and the liability. And so, knowing what we know, I don't think the public has a really good grasp on the fact that governments, corporations, organizations have implemented distracted driving rules. Right. Either prohibiting the use of any handheld or hands-free devices while operating on company or government business. And the public has to understand it. We've got the information and are already implementing those policies within our own organizations. And I don't think the public understands that we do understand the difference and that by and large those policies are being implemented not just because of the liability or economic, because it's evidence-based.
It's DS2. Yeah.
So I think that's something we can do to promote what this group is already doing and why. And the legislation for the general masses is based on evidence.
Right. That's great. Okay. We've got about another 15-minute break here, so we'll come on back in 15 minutes for our next panel. We have a round of applause for this group. He is. He's good. He's good.